So, good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, or depending on where you're dialing in from, to the 18th CIJ Summer Conference, which began today, this year for the first time online, for obvious reasons. Welcome also to what's become a regular fixture of CIJSummer and its most important honour, which is the annual Gavin MacFadyen Lecture in memory of our former boss, Gavin MacFadyen. And this year, I'm very pleased to say that the person having this conversation is Jan Dündar, who's someone whose work and principles I know that Gavin would have loved. So Jan Dündar, for anyone not familiar with his work, is a distinguished Turkish journalist with over 4 decades of experience writing, editing, and making investigative work and investigative documentaries. In 2015, after his paper, Cumhuriyet, published photos of Turkish intelligence services quietly channeling arms to Islamist fighters in Syria, he was arrested by the government and spent 3 months in prison on charges of terrorism. The following year, he was taken to court, and while defending himself on charges of treason, he was the target of an attempted assassination. Later the same day, he was sentenced to nearly 6 years in prison for the charge of leaking secret information of the state. So the following month, Dündar fled to Germany, and we won't reveal his current whereabouts, partly because he remains under threat, and partly because we don't know where he is. We didn't ask him. So first of all, Jan, welcome. Thank you very much for agreeing to join us.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure. And thank you, CIJ, for hosting me.
Not at all. We've been trying to get hold of you for some time, so it's great to have you here. First of all, perhaps to help us understand what we're talking about here, and for the audience too, perhaps you could tell us something about that 2015 investigation, which got you into so much trouble. Because as a Syria journalist myself, I remember its importance, and I remember it suddenly appearing. So perhaps you could take us through what that story was about.
Well, first of all, our paper is and was at that time was the oldest newspaper in Turkey, 100 years old, and one of the most prestigious one. And I was the editor-in-chief, and we've been working on this project for this news story for years, in fact, because this issue was always an important subject. The issue was the relations between Turkey and Syria, and mostly Turkish army and the Kurdish forces in Syria. So Turkey was trying to block a kind of establishment of a Kurdish state in Syria, and just to stop it or just to prevent it, they were kind of helping these Islamic militia in the borderline to fight against the Kurdish forces in Syria. So they were helping them illegally, to be honest, but sometimes it was so open and transparent. But sending arms to those forces by using the intelligence service was totally illegal, and it was a covert operation, of course. But Turkish intelligence service was not. It was not their duty to send arms to a neighboring country, and they were trafficking arms for quite a long time at that time, and they were hiding those armory in some trucks. And they were hiding it with some medicine boxes. And we made several stories on this, but what was missing was the real footage of the whole story. And then we reached those footage, and we published the pictures of the trucks, and we broadcast the video of the trucks. And of course, the reaction of the government was really tough. When I published that story, the then Prime Minister Erdogan said that was a state secret, he didn't deny the story, but he said it shouldn't have been revealed. And he said it was a state secret, and the journalists who made that story would pay a heavy price for this. And since then, I've been paying this price.
Yes. Perhaps you could talk a little bit then about your arrest and the 3 months that you spent in prison after that, how that happened.
In fact, just the other day, there was the prosecutor's office started an investigation, and they asked 2 life sentences for me. Wow. For a true story that was equal to that sentence before they abolished the. I mean, in the old law, it's supposed to be a life punishment, but then for a while they couldn't do it because the elections was closed and approaching, and Erdogan waited till he won the elections. And the other day, after the election, I had a call from the prosecutor's office, and I was accused of being a spy, trying to help a terrorist organization, but mainly revealing the state secrets. But funny enough, my PhD thesis was about state secrets against the freedom of press. And I was kind of very prepared for my defense, because, I mean, this is a popular story, as you know, all over the world. So I gave a lot of examples during the in the prosecutor's office, but it didn't work at all. And they sent me directly to the prison, and with a lot of charges. So for some time, I really thought that it would take quite a long time to get out, because the pressure by the government on the judiciary was high, and of course 2 life sentences was kind of scary. So we spent 3 months in Silivri prison, which is the biggest jail in the world for journalists. There were more than 100 journalists in that jail, more or less the same type of journalists as myself, done nothing but wrote stories or make comments, or even tweet something or retweet even. So it was an interesting experience, of course, as a journalist, to see Turkey from inside.
Yes. Can I just rewind slightly to the investigation again? I was in Turkey at that time and trying to find similar stories at the border, and there were lots of rumors about these arms delivery, and lots of people appeared to know something. What was really good about your story, for the first time you had photos. And I wonder, I spent a lot of time, for example, at the border looking at aid agencies, and there were lots of rumors about the role of aid agencies in channeling weapons. Did you find evidence that aid agencies had been used to channel weapons or not?
You mean?
Sorry?
You repeated it?
Aid agencies, sort of NGOs.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's of course there are a lot of rumors about this, as you said. This is, I believe so. I mean, many states has been using NGOs for intelligence services, and it's not only arms, but they are trafficking human. They are trafficking a lot of armory, and they've been helping them to heal. I mean, they're sending warriors to Syria, and if they're wounded there, they come back to Turkey and get treatment in Turkish hospitals, etc. So politically, ideologically, they are close, and they are sending military support. So I mean, the parliament has had no idea about those, and the public opinion, of course, during our defense, we said that public should know this. I mean, they should have known that Turkey decided to help those Islamists in the region, but without people's consent and the parliament's approval. if the intelligence service has been sending arms to a neighboring country, that may cause a war, so we have the right to know. But they said the state has the right to defend itself. So that was the discussion between the government and myself. But in the end, they said many Western countries, even Western countries, has been doing this, and they're hiding. That may be true, but we are not officials. We are journalists, and this is not our task to hide the dirty secrets of the governments, but to inform the public. But in the end, unfortunately, it didn't work, and we were accused of being spies. Can you imagine this? I mean, just for using the story.
Yes. Can you say anything about how you got the story?
Well, it's not easy, but if you follow the story from the beginning, of course, it's not that difficult, because there are many sources in the region, as you may know, that's fighting, not agreeing with the government. There are Kurds, there are some different groups in Syria, there are some different groups in Turkey. And then, to be honest, there were not too much media outlets to dare to publish that story. So for a paper who is brave enough to follow up the story, it was kind of easy, let's say, if you stick to the story from the beginning.
Yes. So after 3 months in prison, you were released, and then you went back to court in 2016, at which point there was an assassination attempt on your life. Is that right?
That's right.
And can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Erdogan showed me as a target from the beginning, saying that this is treason and this guy is a traitor. And if you are targeted by someone like Erdogan, of course, it's you are in heavy risk. You are under heavy risk, because there are a lot of followers of him who wants to be a hero in the eyes of the government, etc. So the pro-government media, especially in Turkey, was so active, targeting opponent governments, the journalists. So he insisted a lot on this issue, and I was under protection at that stage. But imagine that the police is under the control of the government, and the police should protect me from the government. So it was a bit strange. Funny enough, that day, my bodyguard didn't come. Normally, he used to come and take me from my home to my office, but that day, he was not there. I was told that he was ill or something, and instead they sent someone else who was not with me at that stage. And all of a sudden, I saw someone coming towards me with a gun in his hand, and he shouted, "Traitor," as Erdogan mentioned, and shot twice towards me. But thanks to my wife's bravery, who jumped on him and prevent him shooting at me directly, he couldn't get me and missed 2 shots. And then they got him. I survived, but it was the day of the decision of the court, and it was a strange day. But funny enough, he was released just a couple of months later, and they gave his passport back, and he didn't get any punishment for attacking a journalist by gun.
And who was he? Just a supporter of the government? A random lone wolf?
Yeah, he was kind of a mafia guy who has, interests with the government circles. And I guess he was trying to be a hero in the eyes of the government. And he said he believed that I'm a traitor, and he was inspired by the wordings of the government members.
Yes. So that same day you were sentenced to 5 years and 10 months for leaking information from the state. Is that a new charge, or that's an old charge?
No, it was an old one, but there were 4 charges against me, and they couldn't find any evidence that I'm a spy or I'm supporting a terrorist organization by this. They just said that you leaked secret information. And I told them that it was no secret. I mean, it was a debate on the parliament, and everybody knew the story, but the new evidence we found, and of course it was our duty to publish it. But they said no. So leaking secret information has a price, and it was 5 years and 10 months in prison. And of course, we went to the higher court then.
So you were appealing that verdict?
Yeah.
And who were they claiming that you were a spy of? Was it PKK or CIA or who?
That's another very interesting story, because after the appeal, the High Court said 5 months is not enough, because the court should find evidences that I'm a spy. And they mentioned an important evidence they found that I'm a spy of Syrian government. So the evidence is a letter written by a Syrian ambassador in United Nations. Who read the story 5 days later from my paper, and he applied to the UN to do something against Turkey. And the higher court said, this is the evidence that I'm working for Syrian intelligence. So reading the paper 5 days later has become an evidence for Turkish government to accuse me.
Wow. And so you were appealing that verdict, and in the meantime, or shortly after that, or a month later, you decided to go into exile.
Yeah, in fact, I was the editor-in-chief of the paper, and after I was released, it was quite a tough times, of course. And in summertime, I decided to take a break, and I went to Spain for holiday in end of June. And I was planning to finish my book I wrote in prison and go back in a month. But then this military intervention attempt has happened on the 15th of July, 2016. And everything really changed in Turkey, because then there was no rule of law anymore. And the first thing Erdogan has done was he arrested the 2 high judges who decided for my release from the jail. So that was a clear evidence that they will be, start the whole procedure again. They will arrest me, and it won't be so easy to get out again. You know what? Those judges are still in jail. The judges who decided for my release. So then I talked to my lawyer and my family, and they said, you'd better to stay in Europe for a while. And I canceled my flights back to Turkey and opened the map and decided tried to find out a place to live. I was alone with a couple of books and some shirts and nothing else. And I left everything behind and started a new life in Europe.
Wow. That sort of brings me to another more uncomfortable question, because whenever I talk to Turkish people and Turkish journalists about freedom of expression in Turkey, some of them sort of roll their eyes and they say, well, these journalists, some of them, they were Gulenists, and they were supporting all these conspiracy theories and authoritarianism while Gulen was in league with President Erdogan. And so therefore, some people have not so much sympathy with journalists who were supporting some of these conspiracy theories and authoritarianism. But presumably as journalists, we need to support other journalists, whatever their political opinion or proximity to government. What do you make of that?
To be honest, most of them were not innocent. For years, they worked hand in hand with Erdogan to accuse us and insult us, or they were kind of a propaganda tool for the Erdogan government for more than a decade. But that shouldn't be a legal crime. It's an ethical problem. And what they did was they were writing articles or producing some fake news against us, etc. And then all of a sudden, their relationship was broken, and then Erdogan put them in jail, and they have become Erdogan's new enemies. And now, to be honest, we were together in jail, and they were staying next to my cell. Can you imagine this? I mean, for years they were accusing us, and all of a sudden we were in the same jail, sharing the same destiny. So that's why, of course, I've been critical about them, but of course, I have to defend their rights too, for their freedom of expression, even if their freedom was against my freedom.
Yeah, it's yeah. The bigger thing
is difficult. It's a difficult issue, of course.
Defend the rights of people who you don't like. It's easy to defend the rights of people who you do, right?
Of course, yeah. So I mean, imagine that a guy insulted you for years is staying next to your cell, and then you were released, and he stayed there, and you have to make a campaign for his release as well. But this is the difference between them and us, So we have to defend everybody's right for expression, free expression. If you are defending only yourself and your friends, this is not a fair fight, So that's why it was not easy for us. But of course, now we decided to campaign for them as well.
Yes. I know a tiny bit about freedom of expression and journalism in Syria because in January 2015, I entered Syria via Istanbul and was briefly imprisoned by the government and then expelled.
About it.
And I had this lovely experience because I still miss Turkey and I miss the Turkish people. And they frog marched me back to the airport, these security guards, and they put me on a Turkish Airlines plane, these policemen. And this lovely Turkish Airlines staff member looked at me and he said, why are they throwing you out? Why these guys? And I said, well, I'm a journalist. And he shrugged his shoulders and he said, there's no freedom for journalists in Turkey. It was a lovely moment.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it brings me to my next question, which is, I mean, what is it like to be a journalist now in Turkey? In terms of, is there a climate of fear? It seems that there is. I mean, what's it like? You talk to people back in Turkey and you talk to journalists. What is it like for them?
There's, of course, a cloud of fear over the country, and everybody was under this fear. You know what? I mean, if you put a journalist in jail, that would not only punishment for him or her, but also a message to the others, saying that if you dare to write a story against the government, that's the end of it. So that's why most of my colleagues got the message, and some of them quit journalism, some of them now close to the government, join the Erdogan's troll army or something, and some of them in jail. Some of them are in exile. So unfortunately, Erdogan cleverly first bought some media outlets using businessmen close to himself, and then owned most of the media in Turkey. And at the moment, he has got more than 90% of the media making the same news every day. And you can watch Erdogan in every TV station, almost, and he is the headline of every paper, mostly. But then, of course, the 10% are still resisting. There are still brave journalists trying to inform the public, but they are under heavy risk, you are spending most of your time in courtrooms and visiting your friends in jail, etc. So this is not a journalism anymore. It's like a fight for the truth.
Yeah. I mean, if I was talking to a government supporter in Turkey, they would probably say something like, well, you know, journalism is thriving in Turkey. You know, something like TRT is expanding internationally. We have our own international mission, rather like the BBC. What do you make of a broadcaster like TRT?
It's just a propaganda channel. I mean, you cannot find any opposing politicians in their coverage. Even during the election campaign, they didn't give any chance for the opposing leaders to broadcast their ideas or their programs, and it was they've been using TRT as a propaganda machinery for the government. So, but the good side of it, nobody watches them anymore. So there's no trust at all for the pro-government media. But last week, Erdogan, I guess there's a new era because Erdogan decided to shut down the last couple of TV channels left in Turkey who can, give different news at least, or critical news about the government. And there's a regulatory body, and they said they decided to shut down for 5 days those two channels, and they said the next step will be shutting them down forever. That means the end of the whole media landscape will be pro-government from now on in Turkey. And then again, last week Erdogan said Twitter, YouTube, and Netflix. He gave 3 names, and he said we are decided to shut them down. Then he regrets, and his press office tried to, said that it was a misunderstanding. But there's a law in the parliament now saying that those international global media networks should appoint a correspondent in Turkey that they can deal with the government. Otherwise, they wouldn't let them function in Turkey anymore. So appointing now, it's time for Twitter or Facebook or Netflix to decide whether they will send a representative to Turkey, which makes Erdogan easier to arrest them and blackmail against the headquarters. So it will be a very difficult decision. But the last castle is the social media for truth seekers. And if Erdogan decided to turn Turkey into a China-type administration, that will be a new stage in our struggle.
So what do you think the future holds for Turkish journalism? Is it a bit like Mexico, where you have new operators emerging on social media, telling truth to power on, outside of the existing channels, or Russia? Is it like that?
Yeah, first of all, as I told you, there are still some media outlets and brave journalists struggling. But I'm afraid we are coming to the end of this era, and they will not be allowed in the coming near future, to broadcast anymore. There are, of course, social media is so active, and people now getting information from social media mostly. And there's a new tendency now, which is exile media. So I've been running one of them from Germany towards Turkey. And of course, again, this is also a difficult task because you have programmers or reporters in Turkey. And if the government decided to cut if they decided to block your website or your radio station, it's not easy to renew it.
Mm. Is there another problem with exile media? There is in lots of countries that exile media sometimes falls into the hands in terms of financing of the country's enemies. And so you have to walk this very tight.
Exactly. That's another track. Yeah, it's another trap because you have to be very careful if you are, of course, you are being accused of being a spy by the government. Of course, you have to be very careful about your financing situation. So we decided.
In a way, it's sort of the tragedy of the Syrian uprising. You know, lots of outlets fell into the hands of the country's enemies rather than necessarily for the people.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I've been a journalist, as you mentioned, for more than 40 years now, and this is the darkest and most difficult time. I was a journalist during the military coup times, and even those years were not that difficult, you know, because at least, I mean, for example, in 1980, the military government stayed for 3 years, 3.5. And Erdogan has been running this country almost 20 years now. Mm. And you have to fight not only with the government, but also with your media. You know, our worst enemies are media, and they are distributing news against us, and they are full of hatred and insults. And you are dealing with a huge troll army fed by the government.
Do you think, because I think there's a danger sometimes when journalists talk about troll army, sometimes it's just people who don't share the same opinion as you, but do you think, like China and Russia, there are existing paid troll armies in Turkey?
We know their base, we know where they work, we know their headquarters, we know who are responsible for, you know, governing those guys, and how many of them, how much they are paid, etc. So it's not Erdogan fans, but real professionals, and you can easily understand this. So it's daily business. I mean, you are under heavy hatred campaign or insult campaign, and you have to deal with this.
And what kinds of things do they say about you, Jan? What kinds of lies?
Yeah, for example, I mean, they are publishing your whereabouts, your home address, or they can publish your mom's house address or your kids' pictures. So this is real danger, and it's very difficult to cope with it because, I mean, when there's no rule of law in the country and all the judiciary is under the government control, how can you defend yourself? So it's not only hiding news or punishing the news media, but also targeting journalists. And under these circumstances, how can you find someone to work with? How can you find reporters? How can you dare to follow up a story which is not, which is against the government's interests? That's why I told you, I mean, it's more than journalism now. It's it's a fight for democracy.
And do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? When do you think you'll be able to go back yourself?
Well, yes and no. In the short run, it will be very difficult to cope with it, of course. But in the long run, they can't deal with it. I mean, the world is so you can't shut down all the doors of Turkey. Turkey is not China or North Korea. So in the middle of this between Syria and Europe, Turkey cannot be a totalitarian state, and we are coming to the end of it, I guess. This dark period of time, and Yeah, because I mean, yeah, I'm kind of optimistic, and many against many of my colleagues, because I mean, this is after 20 years now. For example, for the first time, Erdogan lost big cities last year in the local elections. He lost Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, Turkey's biggest three cities. And it was the election, and people voted against him. And of course, especially Istanbul was so important for him. And there's a saying in Turkish politics that whoever wins Istanbul would win Turkey. And next up is Turkey. And for the first time, the opposition parties came together in a democratic front to challenge Erdogan. And this bloc was backed by Kurdish voters. And then they succeeded to get Istanbul. And now the economy is falling, especially after the corona crisis. And economically, Erdogan government is under very heavy pressure, even by his voters. And the last opinion polls show the party is around 30% now, which is the lowest in the last 10 years. So he has to do something. And I'm a bit worried about this something.
Gosh. There's a question from someone called Penny, who asks, what has happened to Cumhuriyet, your paper, since you went into exile?
Yeah, unfortunately, we had to leave with many of our writers and reporters, and it has totally changed. And a new guys took over the paper, and unfortunately, the paper is. I don't want to say more about this, but I can assure you that that kind of a story can never be published in Cumhuriyet anymore. For several reasons. I mean, from braveness to, you have to be good with the government if you want to stay alive, and which is a very difficult decision, because they can easily shut down the paper, or they can put you in jail, and nobody wants to deal with it. I mean, deal with those consequences. That's why new policy is not that, I guess, from my point of view, is not brave enough.
Yes. Another question comes in, someone asking, because I think you did get your family out of Turkey, didn't you? Was that difficult? Your family arrived?
Oh yeah, it was a big issue for us, because I mean, I decided to stay in Germany, and I asked my wife to come and join me, but it was not so easy, because at the airport, when she was planning to come to Germany, she was stopped by Turkish police, and her passport was confiscated. And without any reason, she had there was no investigation against her. There was no accusation about her, just for being my wife.
Yes.
And they didn't give her passport back. And we fight a lot. I mean, we tried every legal way. We tried some political channels. We tried some diplomatic channels. Didn't work. For 3.5 years, we stayed separated. And in the end, last summer, she decided to get out of the country illegally. And we are here together now. But imagine, I mean, even the soldiers during the military time didn't touch the families. Of course, I mean, the journalists were their enemies too, but even them didn't behave the families like this. And taking hostage cannot be a policy of a government, but they did. They took my wife as a hostage for 3.5 years. And what is that for? I mean, for a news story, which was a true story. And it was their dirty secret, and nobody knew it. No, it was not published like top secret document. I didn't find something like this. Nobody said that this is untouchable government secret. And if you don't want to reveal them to be revealed, you shouldn't have done this. It's dirty work.
Exactly. It's not as if you'd stolen a document
No.
from the bowels of the state, which brings me to another question that I see here from someone whose name I'm finding difficult to pronounce, for which apologies, but it's Frederica, who's written, is there a similar witch hunt or hunt against whistleblowers too, or just journalists? Is there dangers faced by whistleblowers or people who might have access to documents?
Julian Assange, maybe, well, not a journalist, but yeah.
Oh, but in Turkey, I think.
In Turkey.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of journalists under investigation, in jail, etc., for several reasons. But to be honest, I haven't seen anyone accused of being the enemy of the state, like me. A couple of years ago, Erdogan came to Germany and met with Merkel, and I just wanted to go to the press conference as a journalist. And just 1 hour before the press conference, I had a call by the press office of the chancellor, and they said, we got a message from Erdogan's side now, and he said, if he comes, I won't. Can you imagine, you're a journalist and you want to go to a press conference to, follow the story, and the president of the country saying that either he or me. So this is something else. No, it's not more than a witch hunt. It's a personal story, personal hatred story.
Yeah. And Frederick has also written, were you under much pressure to reveal your sources for that story, even if they weren't whistleblowers? So the sources.
Of course, a parliamentarian was arrested in Turkey after me, and they accused him for giving me the material. And he was one of the top parliamentarians of the main opposition party, Social Democrat Party. And he was also a journalist, and he was accused of giving me the material. And he's still under the danger of going to jail back again. So, of course, they are trying to punish not only me, but the parliamentarian who was accused of giving me the material, the prosecutor who decided to stop the trucks, the gendarmerie who stopped the trucks, the police members who were helping the gendarmerie to stop the trucks, and everybody about this issue was in jail, kind of. So this shows us the importance of the story for the Turkish government, because it was their, I guess, the most scary story of the government, I guess.
Yes, there's some great questions here. Someone has asked how Turkey's increasingly aggressive foreign policy in Libya is being represented in the Turkish media. There are lots of great stories about what's happening in terms of the export of Syrians to Libya. How's that being talked about in Turkish media officially?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the Syria but Libya now, because of course I told you, Erdogan has to do something to stop this bleeding of his government. And we know from the history that every totalitarian leader needs a kind of enemy and even war to stay in power. And nowadays he's trying different channels, first Syria, then Iraq, then now Libya. And there's a high tension in Libya at the moment. And we have colleagues in jail 5 colleagues now, just for revealing the names of Turkish intelligence personnel killed in Libya. And this is another dirty secret of the government. They didn't want people to know the details of what they have been doing in Libya. And they put the journalists in jail just for mentioning that 2 Turkish intelligence service officers was killed in Libya. So that's more or less the situation at the moment.
Yes. Someone has asked about how far Turkey is on the British government's radar for human rights. Of course, the British government has its own problems with human rights and journalists and Mr. Assange and all that. What do you make of the British government's policy in general towards Turkey, towards human rights abuses, and towards Erdogan?
Well, in general, I'm disappointed by the approaches of the Western governments since I came to Europe. I saw that they can easily sacrifice their ideals for their daily business, especially during the refugee crisis. We witnessed that because Erdogan threatened Western governments for opening up the borders for the refugees and sending them back to Europe. And most of them said, okay, you can keep the refugees and we can keep our mouths shut. So that was, to my knowledge, it was embarrassing. And for example, British Prime Minister came to Turkey just before the elections, and she didn't mention anything at all about democracy, human rights, press freedom, rule of law, or equality of men and women, whatever, so-called Western values. But she wanted to sell some fighter jets to Turkey, and she did. And it was a quite important support for Erdogan just before the elections, and she went back. Of course, this was disappointing. And same with, unfortunately, Merkel government. And she came 7 or 8 times to Turkey in the last 5 years. And in the beginning, especially, she didn't want to mention anything about press freedom. So every Western government has interest in Turkey. It's a huge market, of course, for them. And they are selling arms, and they don't want Erdogan to send refugees to Europe, and they don't want to annoy him. That's why there's a kind of, okay, do whatever you want in your country, and we have a blind eye, which is no good for Europe. And of course, the British government nowadays is so busy with their own problems after Brexit, now the Corona. So who cares about Turkey and the press freedom?
Yes. I have to ask you about one story, because sometimes it's very difficult to get to the truth of these stories because everyone has their own axe to grind. But you know the story earlier this year of the occasion when the Turkish government appeared to be busing migrants to the Greek border, and then one migrant was shot dead. Now, lots of investigative reporters have been trying to get to the bottom of who shot that migrant dead, including Der Spiegel. And I wondered whether you looked into that or whether you had a view, because quite a few people seem to be saying it was the Greek authorities that shot that migrant dead, even if it was the Turkish government's responsibility not to bus migrants to the border. I wonder what you make of all that.
It was a horrible time, and it was a horrible decision by the Turkish government to force them to leave the country, and under these circumstances. But at the same time, the Greek government was also so harsh against them, and they opened fire. And it's not only Turkish or Greek government, but all the Western governments was really kind of so ignorant, and there was a dirty deal between Europe and Turkey before. Turkey decided to keep the refugees in Turkey, but in return they were expecting some money from the Western governments. They promised, and they promised to kind of start the deals with Turkey, agreements with about European membership, etc., European Union membership, but it didn't work, and Turkey was, complaining that the money they promised to send didn't come, etc. And then Erdogan starts blackmailing against Europe, and in the end, he wanted to show his power to convince the European governments to send money. And he used people, those poor Syrian people, and forced them into Aegean Sea. But what Greek government has done was, open fire on them, and they attacked their boats on the sea. It's a sad thing. So, I mean, it's very disappointing for Europe to couldn't find any solution to this problem. And still, Syria is still bleeding. And those people are still under very tough conditions, living under very tough conditions in Turkey. And unfortunately, especially after the corona, it's worse than before.
Of course. Another question about the refugee crisis. Linard says, you make a great point about the trade-off on refugees. How would you like European governments to change their stance? Should they open up to refugees and refuse to fund the camps in Turkey?
I guess, I mean, the main thing is to solve the Syrian problem. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to imagine that all European countries open the borders and accept those refugees. It's not realistic. It's not possible. Of course, I mean, they can do something and they can open the borders and host those guys. And Europe is rich enough to feed them and, host them. But at the same time, it's not realistic. But solving the Syrian problem is more important. And they have to put more effort for peace talks in Syria. And unfortunately, after the United States decided to leave, Europe not an active member in the negotiation table, So, and Europe is not an important actor in the world problems nowadays. I mean, I wonder if we can talk about a Europe anymore. After Corona, look at this. I mean, we couldn't see any European approach or behavior. And look at Italy. You look at Spain. They got help from Cuba, Russia, and Europe really failed to show solidarity among their members. And same in Syria, same in Turkey, unfortunately. So I guess we need a united Europe again to behave together and to defend human rights and democracy again. Otherwise, I mean, we can't expect Trump or Putin to defend those values.
There's a question here from the journalist, William Goodwin from Computer Weekly, who's asked about how difficult it was to start a new life in Europe after deciding not to return. How much support, he asks, did you have from other journalists and your own publication?
A lot. I mean, Germany knows Turkey better than any other European country because of the Turkish population, Turkish Kurdish population living in Germany. That's why I'm here, because they know Turkey a lot. So they know how difficult it was to be a journalist in Turkey. That's why it was a familiar story for them, and they showed a lot of solidarity. But for the government, I can't say the same thing because I've been critical about German government's attitudes towards Turkey. But with my colleagues, I found a kind of very good atmosphere and climate here. And then I could do what I couldn't in Turkey. I could, for example, now I've been writing for Die Zeit. I've been doing documentaries for Arte, ZDF. I've been making comments for WDR, etc. So finally, I found a free space to express myself in Germany.
Good. And one final question from me, which is a related question to your own experience, but different. On Friday, the trial opened of 20, in absentia, of 20 Saudi nationals with ties to the Crown Prince over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Now, what do you make of that trial, given that it rather makes the Turkish government look rather friendly to journalists to have that trial? What do you make of that? Do you think it's a piece of theater? Do you think it's useful? Do you think it's good?
Yeah, I've been laughing about this because I mean, punishing your own journalists and trying to arrange. I told you, I mean, the guy who attacked me was released after a couple of months later, and it was more or less the same period of time. And the same Erdogan is now crying for Khashoggi. I doubt about this, but it was a good opportunity for him to accuse Saudi government, and he tried to use it. But I wonder what would happen if I go to Turkish embassy here. That's why I don't think that Turkish government is sincere about sharing the sadness of the world about Jamal Khashoggi, because I mean, first of all, they should take care of their own governments.
Do you think it's a pattern that governments tend to crack down on journalists at home and then laud press freedom everywhere else?
Yeah, of course it is. It is. But I mean, we should be in solidarity against those governments. So it's not between us, but between the government wants to use some journalists sometimes, and defending their rights if they are supporting their own government. Otherwise, they are enemies. They call them enemies, etc. So it's a tug of war between those leaders and governments and us journalists and whistleblowers. So it's time to come together and in solidarity and fight against them to defend the truth.
That's a fantastic way to end, Jan. I couldn't have put it better. That's all we have time for. I should point out that we have lots more talks and training throughout the next week until Saturday on everything from how to tell stories to how to use open source intelligence and freedom of information legislation. Some of those talks and training are sold out, but some of them are freely available. If, for example, you want to come and hear Catherine Eban on pharmaceuticals and public health, or Annika Smethurst on what it's like to have your home raided by the Australian Federal Police, please do join us on Saturday. In the meantime, thank you very much for spending part of your evening with us. Rather than
James, thank you so much from my side.
Not at all, and thank you to you, Jan. So keep doing what you're doing. We've been honoured to have you, and the best.
Honor is mine. Honor is mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Good night.